Alrighty, well, good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I apologize for the slight delay. We had some technical difficulties, but all of that has been worked out. So welcome. My name is Andrew Doffney. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library, and our presenter today is Melissa Johnson. She's a certified genealogist, professional genealogist, writer, and editor. She has expertise in researching families with origins in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and England, and works on forensic cases, dual citizenship matters, and lineage society applications. She is also proficient in using DNA test results to break through ancestral brick walls. She serves on the board of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey and the International Society of British Genealogy and Family History. She is also the program director for Boston University's Genealogy Studies programs and frequently teaches in courses at genealogy institutes around the country. So welcome, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we jump into her presentation, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions at the end of the program today, but please feel free to submit them at any time using either the Q&A or the chat feature in the Zoom dashboard. Melissa has provided me with a handout, and I will share that in the chat once her presentation gets underway. If you have a problem downloading it from the chat, don't worry, it'll be available in my follow-up email that I'll be sending out as well. This program is being recorded, so in that follow-up email, I will also include a link to the recording once it's available on our YouTube channel. There will be a survey at the end of the webinar, so if you have time, we ask that you please complete it. We always love hearing your feedback. And if you want some more information on genealogy research in New Jersey, the New Jersey State Library's genealogy librarian, Regina Fitzpatrick, has created a fantastic research guide at the web address on the screen there, and I will send that out in the chat as well. So one last thing, I just want to do a brief overview of the Zoom dashboard for those of you who might not be familiar. This is what your dashboard should look like if you're using a PC or a Mac. If you're using a mobile device, your dashboard is going to look a little bit different, but all of the features will still be there. In the bottom left-hand corner, you will see your audio settings. This is where you can check to make sure that if you're using an external listening device like headsets, that is appropriately set to those settings. If you run into any problems with those settings, you can check there, or you can use this raise hand button here. That'll alert me, and I will send you a message in Zoom and hopefully be able to help with any problems that you are having. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat button at any time. And again, we will address them at the end of the program. That is everything that I have for you. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started talking today about early New Jersey, the proprietary era, and then the colonial era, and how to do research during these kind of challenging time periods. So when we talk about the proprietary period, just to be clear, we are talking about from 1664, after New Jersey came under 1664 to 1702, 1703. So it's the time period after New Jersey came under British rule, but before Queen Anne established New Jersey as a unified royal colony. So the reason for the 1702, 1703 discrepancy is that Queen Anne appointed Edward Hyde as her executive in New Jersey in 1702, but he didn't actually receive those instructions until 1703. So while the official date technically would be 1702, the practice date is really closer to 1703. So in order to talk about proprietary era research, what we really need to have a good understanding of is geography in New Jersey during that time. That really is the key to understanding this era and making sure that you're looking at the right records. So when we talk about New Jersey, this is a key date, and we're actually on the anniversary of this date today, June 24th. So June 23rd, 24th, 1664 was when James, Duke of York, leases the land between the Hudson and the Delaware rivers, known as New Jersey, to Sir George Carteret and John Lord Berkeley, who were known as the Lords Proprietors. So this area was named for the Isle of Jersey in England, and these two men are going to be key figures in this time period. When we talk about East and West Jersey, the June 1664 patent is very important. It partitioned New Jersey into those Eastern and Western divisions. Sir George Carteret was named proprietor of East Jersey, and John Lord Berkeley was named proprietor of West Jersey. Those were specified in the 1664 patent. So the proprietors, what they did was they were owners of the land, but they also had authority to sell it, to partition it off, and they also governed the inhabitants of the land as well. Another important document for the era, a legal document, is called Concessions and Agreement of the Lords Proprietors of New Jersey. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. In addition to the patent, it's important because it established the structure of the government during the time and set forth rules for land distribution and for the freedoms of new settlers. That being said, in reality, land distribution and government was handled in different ways, not always in accordance to what this document indicated. So let's talk about East Jersey for a little bit. When we talk about East Jersey, the northern part of East Jersey was very influenced by New York and by the Dutch because of the former New Netherland colony and proximity to that. The southern area of East Jersey was more influenced by Puritans from New England. So there were a lot of settlers that were from Kings County, which is Brooklyn today, from the Hudson River Valley area going up into New York, and also from Long Island, and then from other places in the north, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So this helps to create a little bit of a picture of how New Jersey was established. It also, helps to understand a little bit of the law and how the Dutch rule influenced at certain times, what the religions were, what brought people from other states, those kind of migrant paths. So it helps us to create a little bit of a bigger picture of how New Jersey was settled and governed and how records were created. As far as settlements in New Jersey, they are a little bit confusing, but we're going to go through them a little bit slowly. So Governor Nichols, he had purchased land in New Jersey from Indian settlers. And when that was after all of New Jersey had already been granted to the proprietors. So this created a conflict. The established settlements in Elizabethtown and also in the area known as Middletown and Shrewsbury, those settlements actually were also technically in violation of the proprietors' rights. And as a result, that led to disputes between settlers and the proprietors for many years because they each were doing their own thing, not knowing what the other was doing. So it became problematic and later resulted in an anti-proprietary movement. The death of Sir George Carteret in 1680 triggered some actions as well. So East Jersey then was sold to 12 men, 11 of them were Quakers, and they became known as the East Jersey Proprietors. One share went to Robert Barclay, who, if you've studied New Jersey history, is probably a familiar name. He became governor of the colony and settled in Perth Amboy. So talking about the land grant again, the 1664 grant, it was actually believed to include parts of New York, specifically Staten Island and the land just over New Jersey's present northern border. And the reason for that is because, as we mentioned, the land talked about, the patent talked about the land that was east of a certain point. And if you think about what's east of New Jersey, that's Staten Island. However, that being said, New York did secure land in Staten Island from the Indians in the 1670s. So New Jersey never really claimed or fought for this. New York had always claimed it as Richmond County. Also, the Crown established a boundary line in 1769, and that excluded the Northern Territory that we talked about, the New York area, from New Jersey. And that New York line did change over time. We'll talk about that momentarily as well. The East Jersey municipalities were based on early settlements. So some place names that you may see in very early New Jersey records, they have existed for a long time, but they weren't actually technically considered to be municipalities until a certain point in time. So those early ones were Bergen, Newark, Elizabethtown, Woodbridge, Piscataway, Middletown, and Shrewsbury. So the new municipalities were established in 1693, although, as I mentioned, those areas had used those names for quite some time before that. Hackensack was 80 square miles in Bergen County that was east of the Hackensack River, and that included some of present-day New York. So that area that was the municipality established in 1693, known as Hackensack, is not the same Hackensack that exists today that you think of. Also, the area known as Aquanock and New Barbados, that area was part of present-day Warwick and Orange counties in New York, and also parts of Bergen, Passaic, Sussex, Hudson, and Essex counties today. So that was a very large area, and it's not the area that you may think of when you think of those place names in New Jersey today. Other municipalities that were established were Perth Amboy. Perth Amboy was, again, a very large area. It's not the small town you think of today when you cross over the bridge. It included all of present-day Sayreville and South Amboy, and then also parts of Monroe, Old Bridge, Jamesburg, and Spotswood. So it did go pretty far west into New Jersey. It's not just the little area of Perth Amboy that you know today. Same thing as Freehold. Freehold was a very large area. Freehold itself today is still a large area, but it was much larger when we were talking about the municipality established in 1693. Present day, Manalapan and Marlborough were both included in that. And then also parts of present day Freehold, Millstone, Upper Freehold, Colts Neck, Old Bridge, Monroe, and Plumstead. So that area Freehold had been a local place name since very early on, but again, was a municipality as of 1693. West Jersey was handled a little bit differently. Berkeley sold part of his interest to John Fenwick in trust, and John Fenwick sold that land to settlers, which technically he shouldn't have done. The legality of that was questionable, but it did wind up establishing most of what we know today as Southern New Jersey. And he did still have his other interests in West Jersey. Remember, he just sold part of it. The West Jersey lands were split, and those four men became known as the West Jersey proprietors. So those men were very involved. They're probably names that you've heard before. You've seen in many deeds if you've looked at older deeds. And what this did was it developed a Quaker colony. And there was lots of land contention in this area, and that was related to the Swedish and the Dutch who had settled there long before, and then others came in and created these laws and these processes and procedures that sort of defied what they had been doing prior to this time. In West Jersey, also we had tenths. So the tenths that were established there were the Salem tenth, that was one of John Fenwick's, the Yorkshire tenth, which was purchased by 5 men from Yorkshire and included the area between Trenton and Burlington. The London tenth, which was purchased by Englishmen in 1677. And that included present-day Burlington and Pennsauken Creek. And then the 4th tenth, which was part of the old New Sweden colony, and is now known as Gloucester County. So when we talk about proprietary places, one thing that's really important to remember is that you might find references to place names you've never heard of because they're obsolete. But you might find them in records even when those areas were called officially a certain municipality, because there were lots of little areas and crossroads that may have been referenced as a certain place. And then also the opposite, place names that exist today may not have even been in the larger areas with the same name during the proprietary period, just like the Hackensack example that I showed you. So this is a map that sort of shows the general area and how large these areas were. So remember, we talked about the Hackensack area. If you look at and see where that is now, it's not Hackensack today. And if you look at Newark, that large area is much smaller today. What is known as Newark proper today is not that entire area, which included Newark and all of the surrounding areas. The same goes for Elizabethtown. Again, that encompassed multiple counties. Now today, the town of Elizabeth is much smaller. So we're going to look at some drawings of and images of what New Jersey looked like during certain time periods. The division lines changed quite a bit. So what we're looking at here is 1687, 1688. And the left side image shows the line of division, which was surveyed by Lawrence in 1743. And then later, surveyor George Keith established a new east-west boundary, which shifted that dividing line farther west and reduced that northern part of New Jersey quite a bit. So looking at that, you see that, areas that were once West Jersey and East Jersey were different now. So thinking about how that might impact your research and where records are, if you have people that were in those particular areas that are close to the line, you're going to have to look at different record sets. Again, the proprietary places, keep in mind that those place names were often used prior to when they were officially established. So we talked about all of those municipalities being established. You're going to find those names, Newark, Elizabeth, New Barbados. You're going to find them in deeds long before that official establishment date. And again, those place names, especially the original settlements, did refer to areas that are much larger than those same place names that have been kept today. One example that I'm going to show you is Shrewsbury Township. So Shrewsbury Township was the largest municipality in 1693. And just to show you that how large of an area that was, it spanned from present day Sandy Hook. If you're from New Jersey, you know that little hook right near where it says Perth Amboy on the map is Sandy Hook. And then it extended all the way down to the end of Long Beach Island, which is the island in dark green that you see alongside Monmouth County. And then it went inward west toward Plumstead. So that area was all called Shrewsbury Township. If we look at Shrewsbury today, it's a very small town in Monmouth County that just covers that area. So what was Shrewsbury before? If you find a deed that says your ancestor lived in Shrewsbury, don't think that they lived in the little area off of Route 35. One example of this is a 1691 deed between two men for a piece of land that was noted to be in Shrewsbury. And if you actually trace that land a little bit, it's for land in Ocean County, right along kind of the Parkway route. But it's for land that is pretty deep into Ocean County too. It's not right over the Monmouth County line. But that just shows you sort of how large Shrewsbury was at that time, and that you really need to look into where these people live, not just go by the place name. And if you have an interest in learning a little bit more about proprietary geography, this is a special issue of the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey. It's available in many libraries. It's currently out of print right now, unfortunately, but we are trying to get a new version up and running. But this is a great guide. If you are a member of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey and have received the magazine since 2014, you probably already have it. It was a special issue mailed out to members. And if not, you can find it in some libraries. Another reference for names and boundary changes that is great. You can't research in the proprietary period without it, is this story of New Jersey civil boundaries. And this is available as a PDF. And I'm actually going to provide a link that has it in the chat at the end of the session, along with some other material. So this is a really great guide as well. And it is available if you just wanted to Google, you can download the PDF as well. So a little bit about the proprietors. The East Jersey Proprietors was dissolved as a corporation in 1998, and the records were transferred to the New Jersey State Archives at that point in the 90s. And they include a lot of different types of records. So there are minutes. Remember, this was an entity that made decisions on behalf of the inhabitants of New Jersey. They made decisions about land that was being sold. So there are meeting minutes that may involve an ancestor's land, or if you have an ancestor who was involved, then they may be a regular attendee at these meetings. So these are published in various books also that are noted in your handout through 1794. Also, of course, the records include a lot of land records. So there are deeds, surveys, warrants included among these. And then also road records. So again, remember, the East Jersey Proprietors weren't just in charge of land, they governed the inhabitants, they were the government. So official records that you later see done by the counties and the county clerks, the road records, for example, are something you'll find in the East Jersey Proprietors records. Quit rents as well, dividend records, lots of maps. There are beautiful maps in the collection and other miscellaneous records as well. The West Jersey Proprietors is still an active corporation, and there's actually a lot of vacant land in New Jersey still owned by the West Jersey Proprietors. Much of it is land that is not really buildable because it's wetland or for other reasons. But if you were to look at some maps for West Jersey, you can see that a lot of the land is still owned by the West Jersey Proprietors. Their records are on deposit at the state archives, even though they are still an active corporation. And they include many of the same types of records. So there are minutes of the actual corporation. There are account books, so financial resources, and then land records, so surveys and warrants. If you're interested in the Lawrence Line division, studying that a little bit, if it applies to you, there are a lot of notes and documents related to that. And then again, beautiful maps and drawings. If you have, ancestors who had land during this time period, I would definitely check for those. Some of them are very detailed and they show a little bit more than I show a lot more actually of what your ancestors' property looked like, more than what a deed or a survey is going to tell you. And then again, miscellaneous records too. So looking at a couple of examples, some records from the East Jersey Proprietors. This is a survey. It's not dated, but it is surveyed for John Campbell, who is noted to be the son of John Campbell, Esquire. And it's for what they're referring to as 200 acres of land on the branch of the Passaic River called the Dead River, in full of the addition to the second dividend land belonging to his 10th part of a propriety. And it was bordering lands of Robert Barclay, who at that point was deceased. So this survey can be dated at approximately June 1715, because there's also a deed related to it as well. So this is, again, John Campbell, son of John Campbell of Perth Amboy, and John Brown transacting this deed. And again, it's for the same description of land on the Dead River. So these are just a couple of examples of, the types of material you can find. This one is, you're lucky because there were several John Campbells during this time period, some well-known and others not so much. And this one does specify a little bit more of who he is and where he was living. So that helps with finding out who he was, of course, alongside using other records as well. So as far as finding the records, there are a lot of published indexes to these collections. They are mostly available at the New Jersey State Archives. And I have an outline of them there, and some of them are accessible online that I'm going to post in a Dropbox link in the chat that will also have the references that I mentioned. And it's also somewhat in your handout as well. To find a lot of these records, if you have looked for in the past, meaning several years ago, if you have looked for New Jersey land records for this time period, it's definitely good to look again, because there has been an ongoing initiative for several years now, started about 5 or 6 years ago, to locate records from the early period, from the proprietary period, and to get them all into a database. So if you've searched the early land records before using the indexes I mentioned, the books, any of the resources at the state archives, you definitely want to check this database again, because it is still being added to up until recently. So this database is on the New Jersey State Archives page for searchable databases. It's called the Early Land Records Database. And these are the search options. So if, for example, you just search by name, Johnson, throwing that in there as an example, you're obviously going to get a lot. The descriptions are pretty bulky for some, and then not so much for others. It just depends on the nature of the document and how much it's been transcribed. Something that you looked at years ago and there wasn't a very good description of it may have a better description now. So you definitely should check again. And then sometimes you can actually download a PDF of the file, like you see here in this first example. And that's for deed. You can download the PDF and there's nothing else, that you really need to order. But some of them you can't download a PDF and you just need to order the record from the state archives, or you can go there yourself and get it as well. The Early Land Records project that I mentioned began about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was an initiative to create a name and place index through that database for over 80,000 land instruments. So these are land instruments that come not only from the East and West Jersey proprietors' records, but also from private collections, from deeds that were recorded with the counties much later on that should have been recorded much earlier with the East and West Jersey proprietors. Some of them are in other collections that are not related to land, personal collections. So it's not just the East and West Jersey proprietors. There are other sources of documents as well. So this is a great resource to take a look at. And I am going to see if this works. May not work. There is a website. I was going to play the video, but for some reason it doesn't seem to want to play. There's a website it's off the New Jersey State Archives site and also off the Genealogical Society of New Jersey site, where you can view this video that just tells you a little bit more about the Early Land Records project, and shows you some great images from the actual documents that you can take a look at and see exactly what everyone was doing. Oh, it looks like it is working. So I'm going to look at that for just a moment. Okay, so again, that video is available. It's a little bit dated because the project is almost to an end now. So the funding piece is dated and no more funding is needed for it. But the work is pretty much almost all done. But again, it's a reason to check that database again. If you searched it years ago, even if you searched it 1 year ago, it's worth checking it again. So going into some other records that are helpful for researching in the proprietary era, we can't forget wills. So wills are helpful for any genealogical research during any time period, but specifically it's one of the few record sets that's available during the proprietary period. There is a collection called Abstracts of Wills. It's part of the New Jersey State Archive series. And this collection is great because it's an index to all of the names that appear in the wills or administrations. So if someone died and left a will during the proprietary period, their name is going to be included, obviously, but also the name of, say, their wife that they left their estate to, the people who were the witnesses to the will, the people who were named executors. It may have references to property and adjacent property owners. So that's all going to be indexed in these books. So these are wills that were filed with the proprietors. The wills themselves are now arranged alongside other New Jersey wills and are filed with the Secretary of State. So the Abstracts of Wills collection is a place to find reference to a will, and there'll be a summary of it in there, but along with the will comes other paperwork as well. So you want to track down the actual will in addition to just looking at the abstracts. So this is an abstract of a will left by one of my ancestors, Thomas Johnson. And you can see in here, he was from Newark. He was 64 years old. His will named his youngest son as the principal heir, and then also left some of his estate to other sons, 3 other sons. It names the witnesses to the will, and it names who made the inventory. So all these names, John Curtis, John Cooper, John Pruden, Joseph John Thomas, and Alephilet Johnson, they're all in the index to the abstracts of wills. So if I didn't know that John Johnson was Thomas's son, I would find him in that index, and I, would find him referenced here in this abstract. Another helpful resource is also part of the archive series as well. So these are called documents relating to the colonial history of the state for certain time periods. They are available on Ancestry, but if you can find them in a library and flip through them, it's much easier and you're getting a more comprehensive search that way. Finding them on Ancestry or looking at them on Ancestry is kind of hit or miss. They're not perfectly OCR searchable, so you want to take a look at them in person as well, because you can search the indexes. Another thing that can be helpful for the proprietary period, again, is some later county and municipal records. So the county clerk's deeds technically would have been deeds that were recorded after 1785, but just because they were recorded after 1785 doesn't mean the deed wasn't from pre-1785. So there are older deeds in county records that say the deed was passed, from family member to family member for years and years. And they just never recorded it officially. It was just kept amongst themselves, among the family. So those can be recorded later on, way post proprietary period. Another thing that can be helpful are quarter session minutes and county court of common pleas records, and then county level road books, and of course the deeds and mortgages too. And then township committee minutes also can be useful, for the time period as well. So while a lot of the records are recorded with the proprietors, not everything is. The township committee minutes, there is coverage from some counties, and that is outlined in a document that Joe Klett created prior to writing the special issue of GMNJ. And that's also going to be in the folder that I link at the end as well. So that brings us to the colonial period. So remember, we said the proprietary period ends about 1702, 1703, and the colonial period ends, we'll say around 1787. It's a little bit up for debate, but it's basically the end of the proprietary period up until statehood, maybe add a little bit more for new record keeping processes and practices to go into effect. So looking back at geography, once you enter the colonial period, New Jersey looks a lot different in terms of boundaries and how geographic areas are partitioned out. So before we were looking mostly at municipalities, now we have a number of counties in place. So looking at these counties, you can see here from 1714 to 1775, a lot changed. So we have some of our counties in place here, but not yet all of them, of course. Some of the counties weren't even established until the mid 1800s. So remember, for the colonial period, land records are still recorded with the East and West Jersey proprietors for some time until, the 1780s, when they start being recorded with the counties. Deeds were still probated in East and West Jersey and were filed with the provincial secretaries, and again later transferred to the Secretary of State, where they're all located at the state archives today. So that makes it easy working in the proprietary versus early colonial period. The land records are processed the same, and you can search them just the same. And wills, I'm sorry, that second line should say wills are still probated in East and West Jersey. But at this point, counties are established and they start creating their own records. So that gets us a little bit more to look at. And then, of course, private records become more common and are more available today because they were preserved a little bit more from the colonial period than they were from the proprietary period. Definitely more of a chance of something getting lost the longer it's been around. So looking at those private records, they can be personal papers, church records, family Bibles, things like that. And then there also are records that cover the entire colony. So marriage bonds, court cases, there are some state, or it was a colony then, but what we know as statewide records today. So one good place to look when you are first doing any kind of colonial era research, this is always my first stop, is to look at periodicals. So we have some great periodicals in New Jersey. The Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey is one of them, and then the New Jersey Historical Society's publication known as the Proceedings is another. So the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey has primarily abstracts of records. So they may have a shoemaker's account book, and they recorded that. Some of them are more logical, types of records, like state collections, like the Supreme Court records. Also family histories that have been published, that someone wrote up a compiled genealogy and published it. Also Bible records that GSNJ has collected, they are published in the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey. And then tombstone inscriptions that have been recorded over the years are also included. So this is one example from an account book from Thomas Potts, who was a tanner and a currier. It's published in the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey. And you might not have had, any knowledge of Thomas Potts, but if you have an ancestor who lived in the area, they may be in his account book. So what you can see here is, accounts of different people who, appeared in the book from what time period and what they purchased. So if you look under Benjamin Tallman, you can see what he, what his debits and credits were, what he was interested in, 3 feet of flagstone. Thomas Thompson, he got shoes for himself and paper pins for his wife. So that's helpful. If there's 2 Thomas Thompsons and one was married and one was not, that's helpful in determining that you have the right person and knowing what time period he was around and interacting with Thomas Potts. So these are, very random pieces that you might find in GMNJ, but there are indexes to GMNJ we'll talk about in a minute that cover longer time periods, and you can get a good glimpse at, over the course of 50 years, was anything published about my ancestor. And it's an easy way to search those in one quick shot. The New Jersey marriage licenses that are published here, these are also, somewhat now available online too for different time periods. But this is also something that you would find in GMNJ. So these are marriage licenses. A lot of them are for people that are out of state, or one party might be from out of state, because these were largely in kind of the southern area of New Jersey near Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, Bucks County. So these are, abstracts. And then of course you go track down the original record. To search the Genealogical Magazine of New Jersey, there are 4 large volumes. You can find them at most large libraries by Ken Stryker Rada, and they index the first 50 years of GMNJ. So you can search 50 years of GMNJ pretty quickly. The remaining volumes of GMNJ are indexed individually, unfortunately. So you do have to search volume 51's index, volume 52's index, volume 53's index. One caveat with that is there's a short run, volumes 51 through 63, that have only the surname in the index. Typically the index has the surname and the first name. So if you're looking for Elizabeth Potts, you would look under Potts and you would see if there's an entry for Elizabeth in the index. If there was, you would follow it to that issue. Volumes 51 through 63 have the surname in the index only. So if you're looking at a name like Johnson or Thompson, it's going to take you a long time to do a comprehensive search in 51 through 63. But then after that, they do go back to indexing individually with the first name as well. Also, if you just are interested to see what kinds of articles are available for, have been published within GMNJ over the course of years, there is an author and title listing on GSNJ's website. So you can look and see, if you can do keyword search for Newark or for Presbyterian churches or whatever it may be. The Proceedings of the New Jersey Historical Society is the other publication I mentioned. Later on, it was titled New Jersey History, but it does have a lot of abstracts of colonial era records in it. The volumes are indexed by name annually. Unfortunately, there's no large index for the proceedings overall. So you do need to search them individually, but it's definitely worth a comprehensive search of these two as just sort of a quick literature survey before you start your research, because it may lead you to a couple of really great things that you otherwise would have taken a really long time to find. So the next piece, again, is going to be wills. Obviously, wills, as I mentioned, are very important for any time period, but will abstracts and newspapers are also key for the colonial era. So the will abstracts here, same concept as we just talked about for the proprietary period. The will abstracts that we talked about as part of the New Jersey State Archive series, they go up through the end of the colonial period and actually beyond. They go up to 1817 before they stop being abstracted. Of course, the wills extend beyond that, but the abstracts do not. And they provide the same level of information. So that's good. One less thing to have to kind of switch gears with when shifting from proprietary to colonial era. Newspaper abstracts also become part of the New Jersey State Archive series, and they are really helpful for researching the colonial period. What these are basically interesting things that appeared in the newspaper that are related to New Jersey's history and to genealogy, and they have been abstracted and published in the New Jersey Archive series. So this is just one. It's basically a public notice that someone is looking for Anna Margaret Winch, who married John Usbeck, because her brother Ulrich Winch had died and she was owed money. So this was in a newspaper, but it does help to figure out, if you didn't know who Anna Margaret's parents were, at least now you know who her brother is, and that may help you with your research. The list of letters remaining in the post office. This is something that you often see in newspapers, even, up until, probably the early 1900s. This is a list of letters in the post office in Philadelphia. So a lot of these have to do with New Jersey, which is why, they're published here, but it does put someone in a place and a time. It's helpful in knowing where they lived or where they were from. A lot of business notices can appear there if your ancestor was in business with someone else or had a small business themselves. It could be selling shoes, it could be running the local mill. This is a notice that the partnership between two people is expiring, and basically if anyone has any claims, to bring them forward. Property, when a property is being sold, especially if it's like a sheriff's sale or something similar, that was typically published in the newspaper. It was a public notice. It was required. So this is some information about a farm in Elizabethtown. It gives you some detail. It had 20 acres of land. 5 of that was woodland. 4 of it was salt meadow. And then there was a farm on there as well. So this is just a little bit of a more detailed land description than what you would get from a deed. Some other finding aids that are really helpful, and some of these unfortunately are not accessible right now because Rutgers, although University Archives and Special Collections is open now on a limited basis, not all collections are available. So GSNJ's collections there unfortunately are still somewhat not accessible, but this is good information to have for when they do reopen. Some of these are GSNJ collections that are just basically finding aids. They're collections that were developed by other researchers, and they have good indexes. The Charles Carroll Gardner collection focuses on kind of North Jersey, mostly Essex and Morris counties. So what this is basically Charles Carroll Gardner's research, and anytime he came across a person in a document. For example, this document is part of the Ward family personal papers at the New Jersey Historical Society. This document that's being referred to in this index card is a quitclaim deed between a bunch of men, and Lemuel Ward is one of those men that's mentioned on the document. So he has an index card. I would imagine that if you were to look up Swain Ogden and Joseph Baldwin and Daniel Pearson, they all have their own index cards that have this specific document referenced on them. So there are multiple cards in this collection for Lemuel Ward. This is just one referencing a specific document. So this is really helpful if you have Newark ancestors or if you have Morris County ancestry. This is a great collection to take a look at as well. Charles Carroll Gardner collection also includes a lot of submitted material, family trees. This is a family tree that was submitted by a relative of mine in the 1930s that wound up in Charles Carroll Gardner's The Bound collections, which a lot of the index cards referred to. This isn't his work, but it was submitted, and it's part of that collection. The Supreme Court records are also really great. There's a database that is complete on the State Archives website. It's a similar interface to other databases that are on the State Archives website, like the Early Land Records database. And some entries are more detailed than others, whereas they will include abstracts. Some will not. So the Supreme Court records database is searchable in a couple different ways. There are 3 different versions of different ways to search. So if you just want to do a simple search for a person's name, like Elizabeth Johnson, you can do that. This is a search for John Johnson. And you can narrow it down. So if I wanted to do John Johnson just in Essex County, I can do that and see all of those cases. So you can see who the other parties to the case were, what the type of case was. For example, I would be particularly interested in this John Johnson, Elizabeth Baldwin, Dower case. So that's interesting because I recognize those names. Sometimes you may not recognize a name, but it may be your ancestor's case anyway because they sued a neighbor, or they are being sued because they owe someone money and you may not recognize that name. So definitely take a look and weed through and look at the familiar names. A lot of times it's a family member, unfortunately, that they are suing or being sued by. And if not, look at the others as well. As I mentioned, there's a couple different ways to search on the Supreme Court records database. So make sure you're looking at multiple options too. One of the options allows you to click on the case and see all of the people who were involved and what their roles were. So here you have the plaintiff and the defendant, different officials, and then witnesses. And it does sometimes tell you a little bit more about them, like plaintiff Peter Blanchard was from Rocky Hill, Somerset County. This is another example of how to search for a case. This is the third method. So you can search for all cases that are Johnson and a Baldwin involved in the case. So sometimes this brings up a lot of records. This case, it didn't bring up a whole lot, but it's just a more interesting way to search, especially if you're getting a lot of hits, searching by one person's name. I mentioned there were a couple of collections that were statewide or colony-wide at this time period. The marriage bonds collection is one of them. There is a database on the State Archives website that searches marriage bonds. Remember, marriage bonds were sort of an intention of someone getting married. There are a lot of marriage bonds out there that the bond was filed, but the marriage may not have taken place. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a marriage took place. It probably does, but not always. And remember, not everyone had a marriage bond. They are few and far between. So if you're not finding one for a time period and they were married during that time, it doesn't mean that they weren't married in New Jersey. It just means that there wasn't a bond that was filed at the time. If you don't know a bride's maiden name, which is often the case for this time period, you can search by the groom's last name and the bride's first name as a search combination. That's something I will often do to see, Rachel Atkinson, what could her maiden name have possibly been? So that can be helpful to you as well. And then the marriage bonds can be ordered from the State Archives or pulled if you visit there regularly. And again, I know we talked about some of these when we talked about the proprietary period, but the county and municipal records are also helpful. So land records post 1785 are recorded with the counties. But remember, just because something is recorded post 1785 doesn't mean it's for the time period post 1785. So a lot of the things that are being filed with the county clerks could be deeds from the colonial era, from 1720, 1730, and they're just being recorded much later. So definitely check those county records as well. The road returns, they can provide some information about your ancestors' property if there was work going on in that area. Partitions and divisions of estates are also interesting to take a look at. And then mortgages were filed with the counties after 1766, so a little bit earlier than land records. And then there are miscellaneous record books. Almost every county has them that survive, and that's exactly what they are, miscellaneous records. So if you think about the county clerk and what their job is to record things. So most of the recordings are things that fall into certain categories, like deeds, like mortgages, military discharges. But when something is more miscellaneous, that is recorded in a miscellaneous record book. And then things like tavern licenses and local court records can be helpful as well. I want to navigate through the State Archives website a little bit, just so you can see how to search collections. And I like to use their browsable catalog because sometimes if you're using the searchable and a collection is called something that's a little off from what you think it's called, you may not pick it up. So if you go to the State Archives website and go to search the collections, you want to search by county. And then you can also search by municipality as well. So when you're on the main page with the collections, you go to county government records down at the bottom under other records, you'll get a list of holdings by county. So once you get that, you will, go to the county that you're interested in. It's usually separated by clerks, courts and miscellaneous, and surrogate's office. Sometimes clerks and courts and miscellaneous are grouped together depending on the county. So if we go to Salem County, we can see that there are a couple of records that may be of interest to us for the colonial period. There are Justice of the Peace dockets, 1758 to 1948. There are records relating to Chancery, Oyer and Terminer and Supreme Court cases from 1779, a little bit later in that period, but still may be relevant. So looking at that, you may find listings of records that may be of interest to you based on the county you're interested in. We talked a little bit about the miscellaneous record books. Again, these are just very miscellaneous filings with the county clerk, but this one is interesting. It's for Uzal Ogden, who was the guardian of Thomas Foster, a minor under 20 years of age. And this filing was related to his desire to become a U.S. citizen. So this was creating an official document showing his birth, that he was born in St. Croix in the West Indies. He's the son of Joseph Foster, who was deceased at that time. Thomas was born 1790 and is age 17 years and 30 days. He migrated from the island in 1798. So this is, a little bit later of a time period, but it's referencing someone who was born in 1790, and it's identifying his father, who was obviously born long before that. And it's telling you a little bit about Uzal Ogden, and his dealings with Thomas. Another example from miscellaneous record books. This is a September 2nd, 1793. Basically a note saying that John Thompson, clerk of High Church Parish, and Elizabeth Donaldson were unmarried and free to marry. And then later on, there's another entry that they were married on September 5th, 1793. So this was recorded in 1803. But it is referencing people who were alive during the colonial period. So those are just a couple of fun examples of things you can find in the miscellaneous records for the county clerks. They are actually one of my favorite collections to look at because you find such a mixed bag of material in there. So if there are questions, Andrew, I'm happy to help answer them. I also am going to post that link in the chat while you queue up the questions.
All right, if anybody does have questions, please feel free to either use the Q&A or the chat feature to submit them. Did any of your Johnson ancestors end up in Bradford County or Luzerne County, Pennsylvania?
No, they did not. They were from New England, then to Newark. There were a couple that wound up out in Springfield, Illinois, but none that I know of in those areas, although my mom's family does have Luzerne County ancestry, but more recent Polish family.
Did either Berkeley or Carteret ever set foot in New Jersey?
That's a good question. I believe so, but I don't know for certain.
How hard is it to go through proprietary records?
So it's definitely challenging. They are not as easily arranged as other records, meaning there's not a nice simple index on microfilm, and that there are, it's not always intuitive of where to look. So a lot of it is kind of digging through the records of the East and West Jersey proprietors, which the land records are a lot easier to deal with right now, but since that indexing project, but they are they are more difficult. But if you kind of follow the sort of checklist of the collections to look at from the handout, it's probably easier. I also definitely would start with the literature search, especially if you're kind of more towards the end of the proprietary period and closer to the colonial period. That can also be really helpful.
Do you have any tips on how to search for mid to late 1700 land divisions from wills?
Mid to late 1700 land divisions from wills. So I just want to clarify the question. So do you mean land divisions from like an intestate estate, like an administration, or specifically a will that that specified land? Those are two different things.
We'll see for both, actually.
Okay, so if there's a will that specifies like this piece of land goes to this person, what you would check is the deeds for that time period. So there should be a deed probably from the executor of the estate to, or from the estate itself to the person that the land was going to. If it was an administration, meaning there's no will, then what you would typically see if land was divided is, I had mentioned, but we didn't go into too much detail. The administration, because there is no specific direction, there's no will. So what you would find are what's called partitions and divisions of land, and they don't always exist for every county, but what they are is they're part of the surrogates records. So they're land related, but they're not clerk's records. They're part of the surrogates records, and they are basically the land that the person had when they died typically was, say, divided among their 6 children, and it will show like an actual map of what piece went to what child, and the date of the transaction and everything. And that was typically done if someone who had a large piece of land that could be subdivided died without a will and without direction for that.
Right. Are there any New Netherland records from the 1600s?
There are. So my best suggestion for that is to kind of look toward, I would look at the New York genealogical and biographical records, sort of the same way you would look to the periodicals for New Jersey that I mentioned. And they should be able to provide like a good guide of records for that time period. They've published a lot there. Otherwise, I would look to, the New York GNB or New York Historical Society. There's definitely a lot, more of that there.
Any tips for Minnesink Island or Hopewell area searching 1600 to 1780?
I'm sorry, Andrew, can you repeat the question? I have
Sure.
a bad cough. I was coughing over you. I'm sorry.
Any tips for Minnesink Island or Hopewell area searching 1600 to 1780?
Not specifically that I can think of that are specific to that area, other than, the material that we covered. I definitely would look at the changing boundaries, but that's, kind of a factor with everything. But nothing I can think specific to that area. And I just actually posted in the chat a folder with some New Jersey source material. So it includes some of the references that that I talked about. The will abstracts are in there. Joe Klett's document, which is also available online, is in there. And then some of the other, this folder has source material that's all fully available on the internet on like archive.org. It's all material that's out of copyright. There's nothing I'm giving you in there that's, that you can't find out there. It's just a good resource because it's all in one place.
We are hunting for Abigail Atkinson, who has a 1772 marriage bond with Isaac Piercing of Nottingham, Burlington County. There are no other records because she was a woman. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, for women, basically you're tracing them through the men in their lives. So, the best thing if they owned land, to figure out more about her, like if you're trying to figure out when she died or, things like that, when there was a sale of land, the woman was included on the sale, but not necessarily always on the purchase. So, that's some way to trace her. She should be in the grantor's index when the property is being sold, but not necessarily in the grantee index when the property is being acquired. So, I also would check court records, if there was a dower issue or anything like that. If you know who her family was, which I presume maybe you don't because you're trying to figure that out. Following her family as well, if her father or brother had a will, if there are, if she appears in the will abstracts under her married name, it may be because she's named in her father's will or her brother's will, something like that. So those are probably a couple suggestions to start.
Alrighty, I don't see any more questions, so we can go ahead and end it there. Melissa, thank you so much for fighting through the cough today. I know
I
that's
apologize for it. I had to
but
mute a couple times.
that's okay. A lot of people have been very grateful for the information you've provided. We love having you speak with us. You're a great presenter, and we truly appreciate all the work that you've been doing. So.
Thank you very much. It was great to be with the library again today. Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Well, and thank you everybody for attending today. As I mentioned in the beginning, there will be a follow-up email, and I will include some of the information that Melissa has shared with us, including the handout and the link to the Dropbox. I'd also include a link to the recording as well. So everybody be safe, be well, and enjoy your weekend.